Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Absolver for PC and PlayStation 4 currently, although an Xbox One version is in the works. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a 3D fighting game with RPG elements. It was developed by Slowclap and published by Devolver Digital last year for PC and PlayStation 4, and the Xbox One version is slated to release later this year if they can manage it. And it went on to get pretty decent reviews across the board, although it didn't really seem to get a huge amount of attention, and it's just kind of faded into the background since its release. That's not to say that the developers haven't been working on it. They've been putting out a few content patches here and there, and they're working towards another content patch soon, which is actually going to add a fairly significant amount of content with a new game mode as well as a new combat style and a bunch of new moves to go along with it. So we'll see how that goes. But how is the game in its current state? Well, let's go ahead and start looking at it and find out exactly what we're dealing with here. And we'll go ahead and start things off as we usually do with the presentation, which runs in Unreal Engine 4 and is actually rather impressive, not because of visual quality necessarily, but because they make the absolute most out of the art style. In that regard, it's very reminiscent of a painting with very deliberate use of color and very heavy stylization, which ends up working out very well for the game in general, because this thing isn't really going for any sort of realistic visuals, which not only allows them to do their own thing as far as the various designs go, but to also justify the various fantastical elements of the game. Of course, that doesn't mean that they could slouch on the visuals, and luckily they did not. They've got some very nice designs on the environments, and the animations in particular deserve a lot of praise because they are very smooth and flow together extremely well. Now, of course, it's certainly not perfect. There are a few issues with lighting, and there's also some clipping problems here and there, particularly with certain outfits and certain animations, but for the most part, they've done a very good job with the visuals. Then you move over into sound design and you find that things aren't necessarily what you would expect from a fighting game. Most fighting games are actually fairly loud, but this one's actually quiet most of the time. It tends not to throw in a lot of music except during specific fights or when you move into an area or something along those lines, and when you're actually fighting people, you find that most of the sound effects are relatively dull. A typical fight is actually a relatively quiet affair with not a lot of pain yells or anything of that nature, mostly just grunting, and on top of that, you've got some relatively low impact hit sounds, except when you do a particularly damaging attack, in which case it will give you some sound effects with more force behind them. But other than that, there's not really a whole lot going on. When the soundtrack does cut in, it's actually surprisingly gentle most of the time, and doesn't necessarily fit with a high-intensity fighting game, which makes a lot more sense when you realize how this game actually functions. There's also barely any voice acting in the game, so the only things you're really hearing during fights when it comes to voices are grunts, whereas when you get to the cutscenes, it will have characters talking in a made-up language. But there are so few cutscenes in the game that doesn't really matter all that much. So while they do go for a bit of a less is more approach with the sound design, it ends up being definitely the weaker part of the presentation, which isn't really all that big of a problem because when you factor in the visuals and the sound design, you end up with some pretty solid presentation. But regardless of what goes on in the presentation, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is actually very bare bones. You don't really get much in the way of backstory other than there was this event known as the Downfall, which caused the collapse of the Empire of Adal, the major power of the area, and led to the rise of a sect known as the Guides, who use something called folding magic, which allows them to create weapons or use various special magical abilities like healing or casting shockwaves or things like that, to basically control what's left of the Empire following the downfall. To do this, they have an elite group of fighters known as the Absolvers, who have magical masks that cause them to be revived whenever they are killed, and all of whom undergo intensive training to become masters of the martial arts. You play as a prospect, someone who is trying to join the ranks of the Absolvers and thus must prove themselves in effectively a trial by fire. You're presented with one of the magical masks that allows you to become immortal and sent into an area to train and train and train until eventually you're actually able to complete the objectives of the game, which are to defeat the 7 marked ones, which will allow you to fight the actual bosses of the game, who are the various controllers of the region, and once you manage to defeat them, a cutscene plays and you are presented with a cloak marking your status as an Absolver, and that's it. You're just told to go right back to that area and continue training until you are called upon to serve. The game doesn't really dive into the lore, and it certainly doesn't have any sort of story continuing on after you become an Absolver. It's just you go in, you train, you fight other players in PvP, and that's really it. The actual story is basically the tutorial for the PvP, which in a lot of ways certainly makes sense for a fighting game, but it is a bit jarring when you play through the game, which is primarily PvE up until you get to that point, and it basically says, okay, you're done. Now you just go and continue the PvE and learn new moves, and you go online to prove yourself, and there's nothing more than that. This means that ultimately everything falls to the gameplay, and that's where things certainly get interesting, because this is not really like any other fighting game you've played. Some of the basics you've learned from other fighting games will certainly apply here, but it has a pretty unique system that requires a lot of adjustment. This is because the core mechanic of the game is something known as the combat deck, which is a selection of combos and individual moves that you can do based on whether you have a weapon in your hand or whether you're just fighting unarmed. And you actually learn new moves as you continue playing the game. You'll encounter them as you're playing from other players, of course, but also from the various NPCs that you'll end up fighting in the game. And you learn these new moves by defending against them. If you defend against them with the particular style that you're using's main defensive ability, for example, in my case I used Windfall, which means that my main defensive ability is dodging things, so if I dodge attacks, then I actually learn them faster than simply blocking them. There are currently 4 styles in the game, although only 3 of them are available to you at the start. Those 3 are Forsaken, Cult, and Windfall. I've already talked about Windfall. It's a dexterity-based style where you mainly dodge things. There's also Cult, which allows you to absorb attacks. Basically, you take the full damage, but you don't get any of the stun, so you can continue smacking enemies around. And then Forsaken is all about parrying attacks and counterattacking. There's also a 4th combat style you can learn later on, known as Stagger style, which you can basically equate to drunken boxing. It's very erratic and doesn't have any specific defensive ability, and individual attacks are not that powerful, but it is very confusing. And with the exception of Stagger style, you can actually mix and match moves from all 3 of the various styles available to you at the start, as you learn them of course, in order to create your own unique fighting style, regardless of what your main style is. So for example, even though my character's main style is Windfall, I actually have a variety of moves from all 3 of the various styles in my combat deck, and this is really something you're encouraged to do. You get all these new moves, you mix and match, you find out what works for you and what doesn't, and you're ultimately going for something that you can actually get used to, and that the enemy can't really defend as well against. But it's not simply a matter of mixing and matching the various moves in the combat deck. You also have to make sure that all of your stats are lining up with whatever style you're using as well. Where if, for example, you're on Windfall, you're going to be putting primarily your points into Endurance and Dexterity, whereas if you're using other styles, you might emphasize Strength or Vitality a bit more. And ultimately, you're going for a build that will complement your fighting style and maximize your damage and your ability to continue combos, while avoiding being too weak in one particular area. Of course, before you start thinking that this could unbalance the game horribly, as you level up, you find that the stat bonuses are really only a major deal at the very beginning of the progression. Once you get to basically the level 20 region is when you find the diminishing returns get very heavy on the stats, and they don't really help you all that much from then on out. Once you realize that, it's a lot more about your own individual skills and your own personal playstyle than anything else, and that's where things actually get more interesting, because under the hood, this is actually a relatively complex fighting game. The first thing you'll notice is that this is a stamina-based fighting game, which means that you have a stamina bar popping up at the bottom of the screen whenever you're attacking, defending, or dodging, etc. And as you continue your attacks, your blocks, your dodges, you'll notice that stamina bar goes down and you have to spend some time recovering. This means you can't simply sit there and hold the block button down, because eventually you will run out of stamina and your guard will be broken, which leaves you stunned for a short period of time. This is of course particularly true for guard break attacks, but even if it's not necessarily a guard break attack, if they just keep wailing on you, eventually you will enter a stunned state and just be screwed. Thus, stamina management is key, not just for you, but also for your enemy. So if you can find ways to reduce the enemy's stamina regeneration and constantly force them to spend more stamina than they really should, then you can actually get the upper hand in a fight pretty easily. To do this, you have several tools at your disposal. Obviously, you have the main defensive ability of whatever style you're using, but you also have less intuitive mechanics like the feint, which allows you to cancel an attack in the middle of the animation and basically force the enemy to expend stamina that they really shouldn't have expended, defending against an attack they thought was coming but actually wasn't. This is particularly useful when you combine it with the timing mechanic known as gold linking, where basically as you time the attacks in proper sequence, then they pretty much immediately go into the next move in the chain, and you actually end up expending less stamina, and it ends up being a quicker attack than normal. The thing is, while that's very useful, it's also predictable, so if you throw in a feint or you throw in an alternate attack, that can throw the enemy off their game and they can end up defending improperly against whatever you're throwing at them, and you can use that to your advantage. You can also manually adjust your stance by holding, at least on the case of an Xbox gamepad, the right trigger and pressing the right stick in one of the 4 directions in order to adjust your stance and get access to a different set of moves that might be better suited to whatever it is you're fighting at any given moment, and that can lead to a lot of variety in how a fight's actually going to play out. In addition to the basic combat mechanics, you also have a selection of powers available to you, from things such as healing on up to things like the shockwave, which will ultimately make you more flexible in combat. So for example, if you're being heavily pressured by enemies, then you might use the shockwave to basically reset the fight and get away from an enemy in order to gather yourself back up and continue the fight, or to try to run away of course. Or you might use the gravity ability to stun your opponent, or any number of other abilities that are available to you as you learn them. All of these have a cooldown in addition to requiring the use of something called shards, which are effectively the equivalent of a super meter in this particular game. You gain shards as you continue fighting and defending, and as you do it successfully, that number of shards will build up until eventually you have access to the various powers, and you can also summon a weapon to your hand if you have enough shards to do so. That weapon actually has a durability rating which, after it takes that much damage, will shatter, and you can also have that weapon knocked out of your hands in the case of a sword, and the enemy can actually pick it up and use it against you if you're not quick enough in retrieving it. So you have to be very careful with managing your shards and your stamina, and understand that fights in this game generally are not that short. They can take a fair bit of time, and thus it's often better to kind of wait an enemy out and see exactly what they're doing, observe their movements, and learn the pattern of those movements so you can end up defending better against it. This ends up being more difficult to do in Absolver than it is in other fighting games because of the custom combat decks, where enemies can have wildly different movesets depending on the individual player, and of course the individual NPCs as well, and thus it takes a lot more getting used to than most other fighting games out there, because for example, if you hop into say Street Fighter, then you find it's pretty intuitive for the most part because your options are relatively straightforward. The same goes for other 3D fighting games like, say, Soul Calibur or Tekken, where even though you have the 3 dimensions of movement, the characters all have their own specific movesets, and you can learn all of those movesets and be able to fight against them and with them. That's not really the case with Absolver. Everybody is going to fight differently, and you have to constantly adjust on the fly, and not everybody is going to be able to do that. That's of course not to say that that makes Absolver a better fighting game than all of the other fighting games out there just because it's a bit more complicated to deal with, but it means that it's more niche. Just about anybody can pick up something like, say, Street Fighter or Tekken or Soul Calibur or, say, even something like Dragon Ball FighterZ or something along those lines and be able to play it right from the get-go. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good at it, but you don't have to worry about things like statting out your build. You don't have to worry about which specific moves are in your combat deck or in the enemy's combat deck. You don't have to worry about what individual stats work best for which moves. You don't need to worry about the equipment constantly interfering with how much damage you do, how fast you move, and of course how much damage you take. that's all stuff that you have to deal with in Absolver, because every single bit of equipment certainly has its ups and downs, but you're going to want to go for obviously something you're comfortable with in terms of style, but also which is intuitive for whatever fighting style you're going for. For example, with the Windfall style, it's usually better to hang on to lighter clothing that has a lower protective value, but gives you more mobility and thus makes you actually do more damage. That's not necessarily the case with, say, the Cult style or the Forsaken style, so you need to tailor all of that to your own individual combat style, your own individual preferences, and whatever stat build you've got going on at any given moment. And that, combined with the bare bones, barely even existent storyline, along with the very repetitive, extremely grindy PvE content, and the pretty bare-bones PvP content, ultimately makes Absolver a very niche game. For people who really enjoy the fighting mechanics of it, it's probably a ton of fun. I found it interesting, but ultimately it just kind of wore on me after a while. That constant grind is not something I enjoyed doing, and it ended up just wearing me down over the course of playing the game. I was still able to finish the storyline, but I didn't really do much in the way of PvP, partly because I'm terrible at it, but also because it just didn't really do anything for me. Once I got to the point where I was comfortable doing PvP, I was actually going up against people who were higher level than me and who had been playing PvP for longer and were simply a lot better at the game than I was, which meant that I was getting my ass handed to me most of the time. It's at this point where obviously you would go, well, get good, DW, but it wasn't really a matter of getting good as much as it was being patient with it, because if you're going to the combat trials, which is the PvP section, then you have a combat trial level that will gradually increase as you chalk up wins, and eventually you'll get the ability to purchase items in the store at the various rest points throughout the game, and you will be able to get yourself some better equipment, or not necessarily better equipment, but more interesting equipment than you would ordinarily be able to find through the drops. Of course, a lot of this equipment is still available in the drops anyway, it's just that they're very rare drops, so you may or may not find them. And before you ask, there's no microtransactions in there. All of the currency you use to buy those items is gained by breaking down the various items that you find in the normal drops anyway. So if you get a bunch of duplicates, you can just break them down into the currency you can use to buy stuff later on, once you unlock that ability anyway. And you can also use your combat trial level to increase the challenge rating of the various bosses you're fighting in order to get different rewards, but there's not really a lot going on there either. The PvP still is actually a very heavy grind, and unless you're willing to do that, then you're probably not going to get as much out of it as you might think. This ultimately makes the end game rather weak, because once you get past the storyline and you become an Absolver, there's only two things you can do. You can go and grind in the PvE to learn new moves, or you can go and grind in the PvP to get more item drops and, of course, new moves and get better at the game. And again, if you like the fighting mechanics, that's fine, but if you were hoping for more, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. And that's ultimately the biggest problem with Absolver. Mechanically, it's quite sound. The fighting mechanics are interesting, learning new moves is interesting, and of course, incorporating your own style into your combat deck is definitely very cool. But the way you go about getting those new moves, and the way you go about just interacting with the environment in general, is so incredibly grindy that it just becomes boring. But I certainly can't deny that up until becoming an Absolver, the game was very interesting, and I hope they expand a lot more on the PvE content, maybe put in more story expansions, that sort of thing, to make things more interesting. Or, if they decide to do a sequel later on, then they focus a bit more on story aspects and not on the grindiness. If they do that, then I could see this becoming a real winner. But as it stands, I give Absolver a 3 out of 5. It's a decent game for what it is, and Slowclap are certainly working on getting new content in there, but it's a bit difficult to recommend at full price unless you know what you're getting into and you think that it's right up your alley. So if you're on the fence, you might want to wait until there's a free weekend, or you might want to wait until it goes on sale and give it a try then, in which case you may or may not like it. That's entirely dependent on how much you like grinding and how much you like the combat system. Thanks for watching.